Laudetur Jesus Christus. Vatican and World News.
Today, Wednesday, May 12th, is the feast of Saints Nereus and Achilles, Roman martyrs. And these are today's headlines. Pope Francis reflects on the combat of prayer at his weekly general audience. The United Nations expresses concerns as violence continues in Israel. And Myanmar marks 100 days since the military coup that overthrew the country's elected government. In the Vatican, I'm Christopher Wells. Our top story today, Pope Francis resumed his general audience with the presence of the faithful on Wednesday, delivering his catechesis before a small crowd in the courtyard of St. Damasus at the Vatican. During the audience, the Holy Father continued a catechetical cycle dedicated to Christian prayer. As Linda Bordoni reports, Pope Francis reflected on how prayer is sometimes difficult and on how many great Christian figures struggled to overcome discouragement and crisis in times of trial.
Christian prayer, like all Christian life, is not a walk in the park, Pope Francis told the faithful, pointing out that so many of the great praying people we meet in the Bible and in the history of the Church did not have a comfortable prayer life.
Nessuno dei grandi oranti che incontriamo nella Bibbia e nella storia della Chiesa ha avuto una preghiera comoda.
Continuing a cycle of reflections dedicated to Christian prayer, the Pope focused on the theme of spiritual struggle and on how prayer is not always easy for our human nature. Prayer, he said, certainly gives great peace, but praying is not something easy.
Pregare non è una cosa facile.
Every time we want to pray, we are immediately reminded of many other activities, which at that moment seem more important and more urgent. Almost always, after putting off prayer, we realize that those things were not essential at all. The Pope went on to explain that the Catechism lists a long list of enemies of prayer, but it teaches us that prayer, although a free and unmerited gift of God's grace, can be affected by our human experiences of discouragement, sadness or disappointment. The worst enemies of prayer, he said, are to be found within us. He singled out St. Ignatius of Loyola's spiritual exercises to help us, describing them as a short book full of great wisdom, which teaches us how to put one's life in order, helping us to understand that the Christian vocation is militancy. It is the decision to stand beneath the banner of Jesus Christ and not under that of the devil, trying to do good even when it becomes difficult. And he recalled the struggles of St. Anthony the Abbot when prayer for him became a difficult trial. In times of trial, Pope Francis said, we must remember that we are not alone, that someone is watching over us and protecting us. The Lord, he concluded, is always with us. If in a moment of blindness we cannot see his presence, we will in the future. And he reminded believers that at the end of our lives, looking back, we too will be able to say, I thought I was alone, but no, I was not. Jesus was with me. I'm Linda Bordoni.
In news from the Vatican, Cardinal Luis Ladaria, the prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, has written to the bishops of the United States, urging them to preserve unity amid discussions on pro-life issues. He said it would be misleading if the impression were given that abortion and euthanasia constitute the only grave matters of Christian moral and social teaching. Father Benedict Mayaki has this report.
The prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Luis Ladaria, has sent a letter to the president of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, Archbishop Jose Gomez, concerning moves by the conference to formulate a national policy regarding admission to communion for Catholics in public office who support legislation permitting abortion, euthanasia, or other morally controversial issues. Cardinal Ladaria's letter comes in response to a letter from Archbishop Gomez in March informing the congregation that the U.S. bishops were preparing to draft a document following some controversy related to U.S. President Joe Biden and his support for pro-life policies. The bishops were proposing to send in a draft for an informal review prior to its submission to the body of bishops for a vote. In his letter to the U.S. bishops, Cardinal Ladaria referred them to a 2002 authoritative doctrinal note from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith titled On Some Questions Regarding the Participation of Catholics in Political Life. He noted that that document provides the teaching of the magisterium on the theological foundation for any initiative regarding the question of the worthy reception of Holy Communion. Cardinal Ladaria also recalled that the question about Catholic pro-choice politicians and their admission to receive communion had been raised during the ad limina visits of the U.S. bishops. He noted that the congregation had then recommended that dialogue among the bishops be undertaken to preserve the unity of the Episcopal Conference in the face of the disagreements over this controversial issue. The congregation further said that the effective development of a policy in this area requires that dialogue occurs in two stages. First among the bishops themselves, and then between bishops and Catholic pro-choice politicians within their jurisdictions. After these two stages of dialogue, the U.S. bishops will then face the difficult task of discerning the best way forward for the Church in the U.S. to witness to the grave moral responsibility of Catholic public officials to protect human life at all stages. Cardinal Ladaria went on to stress that if the bishops then decided to formulate a national policy on worthiness for communion, such a statement would need to express a true consensus of the bishops on the matter, while observing the prerequisite that any provisions of the conference in this area will respect the rights of individual ordinaries in their dioceses and the prerogatives of the Holy See. I'm Father Benedict Mayaki.
Turning to world news, violence escalated in Tel Aviv and Gaza on Wednesday, with the United Nations expressing fears the situation could spiral out of control. Lydia O'Kane has this report.
Rocket fire lit up the night sky in the early hours of Wednesday morning as violence escalated between Israel and Hamas. Israel carried out scores of airstrikes in Gaza while Palestinian militants fired multiple rockets at Tel Aviv and the southern city of Beersheba. 6 people have been killed in Israel and at least 43 in Gaza since violence escalated on Monday. In Gaza, a residential tower block collapsed after those inside were evacuated. Another building was badly damaged after heavy bombardment. Meanwhile, an Israeli was killed when an anti-tank guided missile fired from the northern Gaza Strip struck a jeep on the border. Israel said airstrikes had targeted and killed several of the Islamist group's Hamas intelligence leaders early on Wednesday. These exchanges between Israel and Hamas are the heaviest since a 2014 war in Gaza, and at the UN there are fears that this latest escalation could lead to all-out war. UN Middle East peace envoy Tor Wennesland said the United Nations was working with all sides to restore calm, while the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said he was gravely concerned by the ongoing offensive. This escalation of violence follows weeks of tension in Jerusalem during the Muslim fasting month of Ramadan, with clashes between Israeli police and Palestinian protesters in and around the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Both sides have been using strong rhetoric amid the exchanges. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said militants would pay a very heavy price for rocket attacks. Meanwhile, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh said, "If we want to escalate, the resistance is ready. If they want to stop, the resistance is ready." As the violence continues, aid agencies including Christian Aid and Save the Children have condemned any violence from any side that targets civilians indiscriminately and are calling for an end to hostilities. I'm Lydia O'Kane.
Tuesday, May 11th, marked 100 days since Myanmar's military seized power in a coup that deposed the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, has lamented that since the February 1st coup, the military authorities have shown no signs of letting up on their brutal crackdown on opponents in a bid to consolidate their hold on power. Rupert Colville, the spokesperson of the UN's Human Rights Office, on Tuesday briefed journalists on the situation in Myanmar. Here is an excerpt from some of his remarks.
So more than 100 days after the coup in Myanmar, the military authorities are showing no sign of letting up in their brutal crackdown on opponents in a bid to consolidate their hold on power. At the same time, there's no weakening of the resolve of the civil disobedience movement and other facets of opposition to the coup leaders. As of yesterday, 10th of May, credible sources indicate that the security forces, using unnecessary, disproportionate and lethal force, suppressed demonstrations and other forms of public participation, have killed at least 782 individuals since the coup on the 1st of February. While much of the world's attention has been on the number of peaceful protesters and bystanders killed by the security forces, the authorities continue to commit other gross human rights violations against the people of Myanmar. There are daily raids on private homes and offices, and more than 3,740 people are currently in detention. We are deeply alarmed that the whereabouts and fate of hundreds of these individuals are unknown, and these are situations that may amount to enforced disappearances. Of those in custody, the vast majority have not been brought before a judge, while most of the 86 people prosecuted so far have been tried in secret, with limited or no access to any form of legal counsel. Over the past month, the military leadership has issued over 1,561 arrest warrants targeting civil society activists, trade unionists, journalists, academics, public personalities, and online voices, so driving the vast majority of them underground. To intensify pressure, the military authorities have resorted to taking relatives of wanted people into custody to force them to turn themselves in to the police. We're also deeply concerned about the situation of people fleeing persecution, especially human rights defenders and journalists.
Finally, a webinar on Wednesday morning entitled How Does Integral Ecology Shape Our Work in the Pacific Region was hosted jointly by the Australian Embassy to the Holy See and by Caritas Internationalis. Australia's ambassador to the Holy See, Chiara Porro, spoke with Vatican Radio about some of the main points from this morning's meeting.
This event emerged out of an initial discussion, which I've been having with the Secretary General of Caritas Internationalis, about how we can highlight the Pacific region, both because it's not so well known on this part of the world, but also, and more importantly, because the issues that we're dealing with in the Pacific are very central to some of the issues that the Catholic Church is dealing with now, for example, on questions of integral ecology. So it was good to discuss this amongst ourselves, in a sense, initially, with a view to then broadening the perspective within Caritas of Pacific issues, and then with a view to sort of expand that out down the track as well. I think one of the things we talked about a lot was how to improve the networks within the Pacific. As you can probably imagine, the Pacific's made up of lots of small island states and big island states like Australia. And so for us, it's not always easy to work together and collaborate, but I think there's lots of opportunity here, and I think the Catholic Church in particular is critical for this, both because the Catholic Church holds quite a significant role in a lot of these countries. They command a lot of respect in the populations, but are also quite influential in terms of the social and economic, say, values, but also deliver a lot of the development projects as well, and social services and other things. So I think for me, it's really about solidifying these networks, and not just within the Catholic community, but adopting a bit of an ecumenical approach, so involving the other Christian religions, to be able to form a stronger voice, which can then be utilised at the global level, both, say, within Caritas, but also beyond.
And that was Chiara Porro, the Australian ambassador to the Holy See. And that brings us to the end of this edition of Vatican and World News. For more on these and other stories, we invite you to visit our web portal at www.vaticannews.va. Many thanks to our technicians in the studio. In the Vatican, I'm Christopher Wells.